That derelict eyesore is gone, Mr. Caldwell. I had it towed to the scrapyard this morning. Consider it a community service. The voice on the other end of the phone was slick with the kind of self-satisfaction that only a petty tyrant can truly master. I stood in my driveway, the morning sun glinting off the empty concrete pad where my van was supposed to be, a space now occupied by a dark, rectangular oil stain in a profound, echoing silence. The phone felt unnaturally heavy in my hand, a conduit for the pure, unadulterated venom of Karen, the president of our esteemed homeowners association. Derelict eyesore, scrapyard, community service. The words ricocheted inside my skull, each one a small, sharp impact against 25 years of discipline and control. My van, a custom-built Mercedes Sprinter, was many things. It was a $380,000 piece of highly specialized mobile surveillance equipment owned by a contractor of the United States government. It contained classified communications arrays, encrypted servers, and proprietary diagnostic tools that made it, for all intents and purposes, a rolling extension of a federal intelligence agency. What it was not, under any conceivable definition, was a derelict eyesore. But to Karen, whose world was circumscribed by the width of a tulip border and the approved shades of beige house paint, its nondescript gray exterior and blacked-out windows were an unforgivable aesthetic sin. I could hear her breathing on the line, a faint wheezing sound, waiting for me to scream, to curse, to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I gave her nothing. I let the silence stretch, letting her imagine my fury while I methodically cataloged my own. This wasn't just an illegal tow, it was the theft and likely destruction of more than $250,000 of federal assets, a catastrophic security breach, and an act of such breathtaking arrogance that it bordered on the surreal. The quiet war she had been waging against me for 6 months over lawn height and trash can placement had just gone nuclear. She had finally overplayed her hand so dramatically that she couldn't even see the edge of the cliff she'd just gleefully swan-dived from. If this is the kind of story that gets your blood boiling for justice, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I want to hear your own HOA nightmare stories in the comments below, and let me know where you're watching from. This community is for all of us who have had to deal with a Karen, and trust me, you're going to want to see how this one ends. Now back to that empty driveway. The first step in any engagement is to assess the situation calmly, and my situation was this. My name is Jack Caldwell. I'm a retired Army intelligence colonel, and the president of my HOA had just, with the casual malice of a bored queen swatting a fly, stolen a mobile command unit belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She thought she'd towed a junker. She had no idea she'd just declared war on a man who had spent his entire adult life dismantling threats far more sophisticated than a power-drunk bureaucrat in orthopedic sandals. The faint scent of her cheap perfume seemed to linger in the air from our last encounter, a cloying floral note that now smelled like gasoline on a fire. I took a slow, deep breath, the training kicking in, pushing the white-hot anger down into a cold, dense ball of pure, focused purpose. Karen, I said, my voice unnervingly calm, I need the name and address of the scrapyard. Now. There was a slight pause, a flicker of disappointment in her voice when she replied, It's all in the violation notice I left on your door. Have a lovely and much more sightly day, Mr. Caldwell. The line went dead. Taped to my front door was a crisp, cream-colored envelope, the HOA logo embossed at the top. Inside, a single sheet of paper detailed the violation. Abandoned commercial vehicle, Section 7, Paragraph 4. It listed the towing company, K&M Hauling, and an address in the industrial part of the next county over. It also included a fine of $500 for the violation and another $300 for the cost of the tow. The sheer audacity was a masterpiece of bureaucratic aggression. She hadn't just removed my property. She was charging me for the privilege. I folded the paper with surgical precision and slid it into my pocket. This document wasn't a notice. It was Exhibit A. My wife Sarah came to the door, a worried look on her face. She'd heard the tone in my voice. What's wrong, Jack? What happened? I looked at her, then back at the empty space in our driveway, a void that represented a coming storm. Karen towed the van, I said. Her eyes widened, not just with anger, but with the immediate understanding of the implications. She knew what that van was, what was inside it. She had lived through enough of my deployments to know the difference between a problem and a full-blown crisis. She did what? She whispered. She thinks it's a junker, I explained, my mind already working through checklists, protocols, and contact trees. She sent it to a scrapyard. The first call I had to make wasn't to a lawyer or the police. It was to a secure number in Quantico, to a man I'll call Director Evans. It was a call I had never wanted to make. Reporting a compromised asset of this magnitude was a career-ending event for some. For me, it was simply the first shot fired in a war Karen had no idea she was fighting. The sun was climbing higher, the suburban quiet of our street punctuated by the distant drone of a lawnmower. It was all so peaceful, so orderly, a perfect facade for the rot underneath. Karen had mistaken my desire for a quiet life for weakness. She mistook my calm demeanor for passivity. She was about to learn, in excruciating detail, that a quiet man is not a harmless one. The battle for Oak Haven Estates had begun. My first formal encounter with Karen had been 3 days after we moved in. Sarah and I had bought the house in Oak Haven Estates for its tranquility, a quiet corner of the world where the loudest sound was supposed to be the evening cicadas. After decades of moving from base to base, of living out of boxes in places I couldn't pronounce, I just wanted to put down roots. I wanted a lawn to mow, a garden for Sarah, and a permanent place to park my gear. Karen appeared on our doorstep, a thick binder clutched to her chest like a holy text. She was a woman who seemed physically inflated by her own sense of importance, her plus-size frame draped in a pastel tracksuit that strained at the seams. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Caldwell," she'd said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I'm Karen Miller, the HOA president. I'm here to conduct your new resident orientation." The orientation was a 90-minute lecture on the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, delivered with the grim authority of a drill sergeant. She pointed out that our welcome mat was a non-approved color, that the small American flag I'd mounted by the door needed to be on a pole of a specific length and material, and that our trash receptacles could only be visible from the street between 6 p.m. the night before pickup and 8 p.m. on the day of. I listened patiently, nodded, and assured her we would comply. I wanted to be a good neighbor. That was my first mistake. My compliance was interpreted as submission. My quiet nature was seen as an invitation to be managed. The van was the real sticking point. From the moment I parked it in my driveway, it became her obsession. It was a 2022 Mercedes-Benz Sprinter 3500 XD, custom outfitted for my consulting work. The work was an extension of my military career, providing technical support and mobile surveillance capabilities for federal law enforcement agencies on sensitive domestic cases. The van was my office, my workshop, and when necessary, my entire operational headquarters. To the casual observer, it was just a large, windowless utility van. But to Karen, it was a commercial vehicle, a blight on the pristine suburban landscape she ruled. The first notice arrived a week after the orientation. Violation, commercial vehicle parked in a residential area. I responded with a polite letter, a letter, including a copy of the van's registration, which clearly listed it as a private passenger vehicle, no different from an oversized SUV. I explained that, while it was used for my work, it was not a commercial vehicle in the legal sense. It didn't carry branding, it wasn't used for deliveries, and its gross vehicle weight was under the commercial limit. Her response was a second notice, this time with a $100 fine and the relevant bylaw highlighted in angry yellow marker. The bylaw was vaguely worded, prohibiting any vehicle that appears to be commercial in nature. It was a subjective clause designed to be a weapon. I paid the fine, still trying to keep the peace, and started parking the van as close to the garage as possible to minimize its visibility. This only emboldened her. The fines escalated. Fines for the lawn, fines for my lawn, which I mowed every Saturday, being a quarter-inch too high on a Thursday. A fine for a small oil drip on my own driveway, which I cleaned immediately. Each notice was a little more condescending, a little more personal. It became clear she wasn't enforcing rules. She was asserting dominance. I documented everything. I saved every notice, every canceled check for the fines, every passive-aggressive email. I took time-stamped photos of my lawn with a ruler. I recorded our phone calls, informing her she was being recorded as required by state law. In one memorable exchange, she told me, "Mr. Caldwell, your meticulous record-keeping is noted, but it won't change the fact that this is my community, and I will protect its property values from your industrial aesthetic." My industrial aesthetic. I was a man who had coordinated intelligence operations in war zones, and I was being lectured about aesthetics by a woman whose primary contribution to society was complaining about mailbox colors. The irony was suffocating. The morning she towed the van was the culmination of this campaign. She must have watched me leave for my morning run, seen her window of opportunity, and pounced. The towing company, K&M Hauling, was a detail that immediately set off alarm bells. A quick search revealed it was a cash-only operation with a string of Better Business Bureau complaints and a registered agent named Kevin Miller, her brother-in-law. This wasn't just enforcement, it was a racket. She was using her position to generate business for her family. After ending the call with Director Evans, who was now scrambling his people, my next call was to my lawyer. David Reed had been a captain in the JAG Corps under my command in Afghanistan. Now he ran a small but formidable civil litigation firm downtown. "Jack," he said, his voice instantly shifting from casual to serious when he heard mine. "What's wrong?" I laid it out for him, the HOA, Karen, the harassment, the illegal towing, the nature of the van, the federal involvement. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Okay," David said slowly. "Okay, Jack, first, don't contact her again. Don't call the towing company. Don't do anything but breathe. You've been documenting everything, you said." "Everything," I confirmed. "Good. She thinks she's won. She's gloating. We're going to let her enjoy that feeling for a little while. We're going to let her get comfortable. And while she's basking in her petty victory, we are going to build a cage of legal and financial consequence around her so thick that she'll never see the light of day again." The cold ball of anger in my gut began to feel like a well-honed weapon. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by the familiar clarity of a mission plan. Karen Miller wanted a war over aesthetics. I was going to give her a war of attrition, fought with depositions, subpoenas, and federal statutes. She had picked a fight with the wrong quiet neighbor. David Reed's office was a study in controlled chaos, books and files stacked in precarious towers, but the surface of his large mahogany desk was immaculate. On it, he spread out the documents I'd brought, the HOA covenants, every violation notice, copies of the checks for the fines I'd paid, my call logs, and transcripts of the recorded conversations. He read through them in silence, his expression growing grimmer with each page. He was a small, wiry man with an intensity that always seemed too large for his frame. In the field, he'd been relentless, a legal bulldog who could dissect an enemy's standard operating procedures and find a weakness to exploit. As a civilian lawyer, he applied the same tenacity to contracts and torts. "She's not just a bully, Jack," he said, finally looking up. "She's a crook. This whole setup with K&M Hauling is textbook racketeering. She's using the HOA as an enterprise to enrich her family. The commercial in nature clause is so intentionally vague it's legally indefensible. She knows it. She's counting on people being too intimidated or too tired to fight a $100 fine." He tapped the towing notice. "But this is different. This is grand larceny, conversion of property, and because of the van's contents and ownership, it's a dozen other things that have felony written all over them." His strategy was simple and brutal. We would fight on two fronts. The first was civil. We would sue Karen personally, not just the HOA. We would name her as the primary defendant and the HOA board as co-defendants for dereliction of their fiduciary duty. We would sue for the full replacement value of the van and its contents, for punitive damages, for emotional distress, and for the return of every single fine I had paid. We would also file for an immediate injunction to freeze her power as HOA president. The second front was criminal. "Director Evans and his people will handle their part," David said, his voice low. "The FBI doesn't take kindly to having their assets stolen and sent to a scrapyard. They'll open a federal investigation. That's a separate beast entirely, and it's one that will terrify her once she realizes it's real. Our job is to use the civil case to turn up the heat and force her into making mistakes on the criminal side. The first step was a formal demand letter. It wasn't a request, it was a declaration. David drafted it while I sat in his office. It was a masterpiece of legal threat, citing state towing laws she had violated, property rights statutes she had trampled, and the specific civil codes under which we would be suing. It demanded the immediate and unharmed return of the vehicle to my driveway within 24 hours, the full reimbursement of all fines, and a formal letter of apology to be distributed to the entire community. As a final flourish, it included a preliminary damage estimate of $450,000 for the vehicle and its specialized equipment, a number we knew was conservative but was high enough to induce cardiac arrest. "We'll send this via certified mail to her and every member of the HOA board," David explained. "We want the board members to know exactly the kind of liability she's exposed them to. We want them to panic. We want them to turn on her." While David worked on the legal front, I started my own reconnaissance. I spent the afternoon walking the neighborhood, talking to my neighbors. I didn't mention my van. I just asked about their experiences with the HOA. The stories poured out. I met the widow whose memorial rose garden for her late husband was deemed a violation because the trellises weren't on the pre-approved list. Karen had made her tear it down. I spoke to the young couple who were being fined weekly because the special needs ramp they'd installed for their son was painted a shade of brown that was inconsistent with the community's color palette. I met a dozen others, all with similar stories of petty harassment, arbitrary fines, and the general sense of being held hostage by Karen's whims. A pattern emerged. Karen targeted the vulnerable, the elderly, new families, people she thought wouldn't or couldn't fight back. She used the HOA's power not to maintain the community, but to feed her own ego and, as is now suspected, her brother-in-law's bank account. For every car towed, for every contractor hired to fix a violation like cutting a lawn or trimming a hedge, K&M Hauling or another Miller family-connected business was likely getting the contract. I returned home that evening and created a new file, separate from my own. This one was titled Oak Haven Estates, Pattern of Abuse. I started a spreadsheet listing names, dates, violations, and the financial impact on each family. What had started as a personal fight was now something much bigger. Karen hadn't just wronged me, she had systematically preyed on our entire community. The demand letter went out the next morning. The 24-hour clock started ticking. I knew she wouldn't comply. Her ego wouldn't allow it. I was counting on her arrogance. I was counting on her to double down, to escalate, to dig her own grave a little deeper. The quiet suburban street outside my window seemed to be holding its breath. The pieces were moving on the board. The trap was being set. And Karen, in her pastel kingdom, had no idea she was already caught in the crosshairs. Karen's response to the demand letter was even more belligerent than I had anticipated. She didn't reply to me or David directly. Instead, she posted a notice on the community bulletin board, a smirking, passive-aggressive screed about frivolous legal threats from residents who refuse to abide by the community standards that protect all of our property values. She wrote, "Be assured your HOA board will not be intimidated by bully tactics. We will continue to vigorously enforce the covenants to keep Oak Haven beautiful and desirable." She underlined vigorously enforce. It was a public declaration of war. Attached to the bottom of the notice was a new violation delivered to my door. A $200 fine for failure to maintain a vehicle in operational condition, citing the fact that my van was no longer in my driveway. The sheer galaxy-brained absurdity of fining me for the absence of the vehicle she had illegally towed was breathtaking. It was the act of a tyrant so drunk on power she had lost all connection to logic. David was ecstatic when I told him. "It's beautiful," he cackled over the phone. "She's creating a paper trail of her own malice. This isn't just a mistake, it's evidence of intent. Keep it. We'll add it to the pile." The HOA board members, however, were not as confident. Two of them called David's office within hours of receiving their copies of the demand letter. They were terrified. One, a retired accountant named George, was practically hyperventilating. They claimed they had no idea about the specifics of my situation, that Karen handled all violation enforcement herself. They were classic enablers, happy to enjoy the prestige of a board position without taking any responsibility. David calmly explained to them that their ignorance was not a legal defense. As board members, they had a fiduciary duty to oversee the HOA's operations. By allowing Karen to run unchecked, they were complicit and equally liable. He advised them to secure their own legal counsel. The seed of dissent was planted. The board was beginning to fracture. Meanwhile, the federal gears were grinding. Two FBI agents, a man named Davies and a woman named Chen, met me at a coffee shop far from the neighborhood. They were all business, their faces impassive, their questions precise. They weren't interested in the HOA drama. They were interested in their missing asset. I gave them everything: my timeline, my documentation, the details on K and M hauling, and my assessment of Karen's personality. She believes this is a simple dispute over a junk van, agents, I told them. She has no comprehension of what she's actually done. Her arrogance is her weak point. She'll lie to you, but she'll do it badly because she can't imagine you're more important than she is. Agent Davies took notes, his pen scratching methodically in a small black book. "We'll handle the recovery of the asset, Colonel," he said, using my old title as a sign of respect. "Our immediate priority is containment. We need to know who has access to the vehicle and what data, if any, has been compromised." They paid a visit to K&M hauling that afternoon. From what I pieced together later, the scene was something out of a movie. The scrapyard was a muddy, disorganized lot filled with rusting hulks, run by Karen's brother-in-law, Kevin Miller, a greasy man with faded tattoos and a perpetual sneer. When two agents in dark suits flashed their badges and started asking about a specific gray Sprinter van, Kevin apparently tried to play the tough guy. He demanded a warrant and told them to get off his property. Agent Chen, without raising her voice, reportedly informed him that his cooperation was not optional and that his entire lot was now a potential federal crime scene. She explained that obstructing a federal investigation was a felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison, and that they were moments away from getting a warrant that would allow them to dismantle his entire operation, piece by piece. Kevin's bravado evaporated. He led them to the van. It was parked in the back, behind a stack of crushed cars, thankfully not yet scrapped. But the side door had been jimmied open, the lock broken. The agents sealed the vehicle and the entire lot, declaring it off limits. Kevin Miller was no longer a small-time tow truck operator bullying suburbanites. He was a person of interest in a federal investigation involving the theft of government property. He was terrified, and terrified people talk. The next day, Karen received a phone call. It wasn't from me or my lawyer. It was from Agent Davies. He was polite, professional, and utterly chilling. He identified himself and informed her that he was investigating the theft of a vehicle from my property. He asked her to explain in her own words the circumstances under which the vehicle was removed. This was the moment where any rational person would have realized they were in over their head, hired a lawyer, and shut up. But Karen was not a rational person. She was a queen in her castle, and these were mere servants of a lesser kingdom. She launched into a self-righteous tirade about HOA bylaws, property values, and derelict vehicles. She admitted proudly to ordering the tow. She was, in her mind, the hero of the story, the brave civil servant cleaning up the neighborhood. Agent Davies let her talk, patiently listening as she confessed to a federal crime on a recorded line. He didn't challenge her. He didn't correct her. He just let her bury herself, word by glorious, arrogant word. He ended the call by saying, "Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Miller. We'll be in touch." The noose was tightening, and she was still admiring the rope. The FBI's involvement transformed the landscape of the conflict. It was no longer a neighborhood squabble. It was a serious criminal matter with national security implications. Director Evans called me personally to give me an update. "Jack, the van is secure," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "The good news is the primary data servers are intact and still encrypted. The bad news is the door was forced. We have to assume the interior was compromised. We're treating this as a significant security breach." He explained that a forensics team was going over the van inch by inch. They were inventorying every piece of equipment, checking for damage, and most importantly, sweeping for any listening devices or trackers that might have been planted. The cost of the damage to the door, the compromised security systems, and the complete diagnostic overhaul would run into the tens of thousands of dollars. "We've got Kevin Miller on a leash," Evans continued. "He sang like a canary. He confirmed Karen ordered the tow, that she specifically told him to get rid of it, and that she assured him it was abandoned junk. He also admitted to forcing the door because he was curious what was inside. He saw the electronics, got spooked, and just left it in the back of the lot." Kevin had also rolled on his sister-in-law completely, providing the FBI with bank statements and texts that showed a clear pattern of her directing HOA towing and contract work to him in exchange for kickbacks. The racketeering angle David had suspected was now confirmed with hard evidence. Karen, however, remained blissfully ignorant, cocooned in her own self-importance. She interpreted the FBI's professional demeanor as a sign that they believed her story. She sent out another community-wide email, this time portraying herself as a victim. "As some of you may be aware," she wrote, "a resident has made baseless accusations regarding a simple bylaw enforcement action. This has now unbelievably involved federal authorities, wasting taxpayer money and distracting them from real crimes. I am cooperating fully, as I have nothing to hide. I will always stand firm in my duty to protect our community." The email was a catastrophic miscalculation. To the neighbors I had spoken with, it was a confirmation of her narcissism. To the increasingly nervous board members, it was proof she was unhinged. To Agent Davies and his team, it was another piece of evidence demonstrating her state of mind. To David and me, it was a gift. We used the email as Exhibit C in our revised civil complaint. We were no longer just suing for damages, we were now adding defamation and libel to the list. David filed the lawsuit officially the next day. The moment Karen was served with the papers was, by all accounts, a spectacle. A process server delivered the thick packet of legal documents to her at the community pool, where she was holding court on a lounge chair. In front of a dozen of her neighbors, she was handed a lawsuit that accused her of grand larceny, racketeering, conspiracy, and defamation, and named her personally for damages in the amount of $1 million. Witnesses said she went pale, then purple with rage. She threw the papers on the ground, shouting that it was all lies and harassment. Her public image as the benevolent neighborhood matriarch shattered in an instant. The whispers started immediately. The community that she had ruled through fear and intimidation was beginning to turn on her. People I had spoken to in confidence were now calling each other, comparing notes, realizing the scope of her abuse. The widow with the rose garden, the family with the wheelchair ramp, the dozens of others she had bullied, they were all seeing the same lawsuit documents circulating online. They saw my name, but they recognized their own stories in the pattern of behavior described. The fear she had cultivated was being replaced by a collective, simmering anger. I became an unlikely focal point. People would stop me on my walks, initially hesitant, then eager to share their own experiences. I listened to every story, took notes, and encouraged them to contact David. Our individual case was expanding into a potential class action lawsuit. The Oak Haven Estates HOA was about to face a full-blown insurrection led by the quiet man with the derelict van. The most significant development, however, happened quietly. Agent Chen from the FBI paid me a visit. She sat in my living room, her posture perfect, her gaze direct. "Colonel Caldwell," she began, "based on our investigation into the compromised vehicle, we have reason to believe that the actions of Karen and Kevin Miller were not just negligent, but potentially constitute a violation of federal law, specifically 18 U.S. Code Section 641, theft of government property. The U.S. Attorney's Office is now reviewing the case for possible criminal charges." This was the moment I had been waiting for. The civil suit was about compensation and justice for the community, but federal criminal charges were about consequences. Real, unavoidable, life-altering consequences. The Queen was about to be checked. Her little kingdom of beige houses and manicured lawns was on the verge of being dismantled by the full weight and power of the United States government, a force she could not intimidate, fine, or dismiss with a passive-aggressive email. The pressure on Karen was now coming from all sides, a multi-front war she was completely unprepared to fight. The civil lawsuit landed like a bomb, creating chaos within the HOA's leadership. The two board members who had previously contacted David, along with a third, demanded an emergency board meeting. They had retained their own lawyer who had advised them to distance themselves from Karen as quickly and as publicly as possible. The HOA's own legal counsel, a slick corporate lawyer who was used to dealing with contract disputes, not federal criminal investigations, was in full panic mode. He advised the board that their insurance policy likely wouldn't cover intentional criminal acts, meaning they could all be held personally liable for the $1 million judgment we were seeking. The emergency meeting was held in the community clubhouse, and from what I heard from my neighbor George, the retired accountant, it was a bloodbath. Karen, still defiant, tried to control the room, dismissing our lawsuit as a desperate shakedown. But the other board members, now facing financial ruin, were having none of it. They grilled her about the towing company, the kickbacks, the long history of complaints. They demanded to see the financials she always kept close to her vest. She refused, citing privacy concerns. The meeting devolved into a screaming match. The board voted 3-1 to strip her of her presidential powers pending the outcome of the legal proceedings. They suspended all fines and enforcement actions she had initiated. In one fell swoop, her reign was effectively over. She stormed out of the meeting, but the damage was done. Her power within the community had been built on a carefully constructed illusion of authority, and it had just been publicly dismantled. She was isolated, a general with no army. On the federal front, the U.S. Attorney's Office moved faster than I expected. They convened a grand jury. Kevin Miller, facing serious charges in the forfeiture of his business, had agreed to testify against his sister-in-law in exchange for a plea deal. The FBI had phone records, bank records, and his sworn testimony. It was an open and shut case. The trap David and I had envisioned was now fully sprung, and Karen was thrashing in its jaws, making things worse for herself with every move. Her response to being served was to hire the cheapest, most bombastic lawyer she could find. He filed a motion to dismiss our lawsuit, calling it a fanciful work of fiction. He then went on local news, claiming his client was the victim of a coordinated smear campaign by a disgruntled resident with a vendetta. This was a colossal error. It gave our story a public platform. David was masterful in his response. He didn't get into a war of words. He simply released a statement, the press. The facts of this case are laid out in our 48-page civil complaint, which is a matter of public record. We have supplied more than 100 pages of evidence to the court, including financial records and recorded conversations. We are confident that the justice system will reveal the truth. The mention of recorded conversations sent a fresh wave of panic through Karen. She knew what she had said on those calls. She knew she had admitted to everything. The public exposure was brutal. Local news outlets picked up the story. HOA president sued for $1 million, accused of racketeering and theft of federal vehicle. The narrative was irresistible. The power-mad HOA president versus the quiet veteran. The comment sections online were a tidal wave of support for our side and vitriol for Karen. People from all over the country shared their own HOA horror stories. The annual HOA meeting, scheduled for the end of the month, was now set to be the main event. It had transformed from a sleepy procedural gathering into a public tribunal. The recall petitions were already circulating. Enough signatures had been gathered to force a vote to remove the entire board and elect a new one. I had been asked to run, but I declined. I didn't want power, I wanted peace. My goal was simply to dismantle the corrupt system she had built. The final pieces of our strategy were falling into place. We had the lawsuit. We had the support of the community. We had the federal government closing in on her. But there was one more thing we needed, a public reckoning. David and I planned for the annual meeting to be the stage for the final act. We arranged for a projector and screen. We coordinated with the other residents who had been wronged by Karen. They would each have 3 minutes to speak, to tell their stories, to present their evidence of her abuse. We would create a chronological narrative of her tyranny, told by the voices of her victims. I would go last. I wouldn't just be speaking as Jack Caldwell, the disgruntled neighbor. I would be presenting the full, unvarnished truth of what she had done, backed by a mountain of evidence that would be impossible for anyone to ignore. She thought she could silence me with a violation notice in a tow truck. She was about to find out that she had instead given me the biggest microphone imaginable. The stage was set for her complete and utter humiliation. The night of the Oak Haven Estates annual HOA meeting, The community clubhouse was packed. Every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. This wasn't a typical meeting about budgets and landscaping. It was a referendum on Karen Miller's reign of terror. She sat at the head table with the other three board members, looking pale and strained, but still trying to project an aura of command. She was dressed in a severe navy blue pantsuit, a veritable admiral of a sinking ship. Her cheap lawyer sat beside her, whispering in her ear and shuffling papers with an air of unearned confidence. The meeting began with procedural formalities, but no one was paying attention. They were all waiting for the open forum, the part of the evening reserved for resident comments. The first to speak was Mrs. Gable, the widow whose memorial rose garden Karen had forced her to destroy. She was a small, frail woman, but her voice was steady and clear as she stood at the podium. She didn't speak with anger, but with a profound sadness that was far more damning. She described her husband, his love for gardening, and how the roses were her last living connection to him. She held up the violation notices Karen had sent her hand trembling slightly. She called my husband's memory an unapproved landscape modification. Mrs. Gable said, her voice cracking. Property values are important, I suppose. But are they more important than a widow's comfort? Is that the kind of community we want to be? The room was silent, the impact of her simple, heartfelt words washing over the crowd. Next came the Patels, the young couple with the son who used a wheelchair. Mr. Patel laid out a detailed timeline of the fines and harassment they had endured over the color of their ramp. He presented emails from Karen in which she referred to the medically necessary ramp as an eyesore that was disrupting the aesthetic harmony of the street. He concluded by saying, "My son has to fight battles every single day. He shouldn't have to fight one just to get into his own home." One by one, they came to the podium. A dozen residents, each with a story of being targeted, bullied, and extorted over the most trivial of matters. A retired firefighter was fined because his RV, which he used for family vacations, was parked in his driveway for 2 days while he loaded it, a violation of the 24-hour rule. A young mother was cited because her children's brightly colored playset was visible over the top of her fence. With each speaker, the case against Karen grew, not in a legal sense, but in a moral one. The community was hearing for the first time the full scope of her systemic cruelty. Her face grew tighter, her jaw clenched. Her lawyer kept whispering to her, likely telling her to stay quiet, but the damage was being done. Finally, it was my turn. I walked to the podium and set up my laptop, connecting it to the projector. The first image that appeared on the screen behind Karen was the violation notice she had taped to my door, the one fining me for the van she had stolen. "Good evening," I began, my voice calm and measured, resonating through the hushed room. "My name is Jack Caldwell. Many of you know me as the man with the van. Karen Miller knows me as the man who is suing her for $1 million. I let that sink in for a moment. Then I walked them through the entire story, methodically, dispassionately. I put up photos of the polite letters I had sent. Then I played the audio from our phone calls. The projector displayed the transcripts as the audio played, her voice filling the room, dripping with condescension and arrogance. "This is my community, and I will protect its property values from your industrial aesthetic," the crowd murmured. I then displayed the bank records, obtained through legal discovery, showing the payments from the HOA to K&M Hauling, and the corresponding payments from K&M Hauling into Karen Miller's personal bank account. The kickbacks, the embezzlement, the gasps in the room were audible. Her lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection! This is a slanderous accusation. This is not a courtroom." "You're right," I said, turning to face him. "It's not. It's a community meeting. And this community deserves to know that their HOA fees were being used to line their president's pockets." I turned back to the crowd, but this was never just about the money. It was about abuse of power. Karen didn't just tow my van. She tried to have it destroyed. She called it a derelict eyesore. She thought it was junk. I clicked to the next slide. It was a high-resolution photo of the van's interior, taken before the incident. The racks of glowing servers, the complex communications arrays, the monitors displaying satellite data. "This," I said, my voice dropping, "is what she thought was junk." I let the image hang there. the stark contrast between her words and the reality on the screen telling its own story. This van is a mobile command unit. It is a highly sensitive piece of equipment that I operate under a contract with the United States government, specifically with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Karen's face had gone from pale to a ghastly shade of gray. She looked like she was going to be sick. When Karen Miller had my van illegally towed and broken into, I continued, she didn't just commit a crime against me. She committed a crime against the United States. She compromised a federal asset and triggered a national security investigation. I paused, letting the full weight of my words settle. I looked directly at Karen. Her facade of control was completely gone. She was staring at the screen, her mouth slightly agape, a look of pure, unadulterated terror in her eyes. The queen was naked in front of her court, her crimes exposed, her power evaporated. The public reckoning was complete. The final blow landed not with a shout, but with a calm, authoritative voice from the back of the room. Ms. Miller? Karen Miller? Two figures who had been standing quietly by the exit began to walk down the central aisle. They were Agent Davies and Agent Chen from the FBI. They were dressed in professional suits, their demeanor calm but unyielding. The entire room turned to watch them, a wave of stunned silence rippling through the crowd. They stopped directly in front of the head table, their focus entirely on Karen. "My name is Special Agent Davies, and this is Special Agent Chen," Davies said, his voice carrying easily in the dead quiet of the clubhouse. He held up his badge. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Karen's lawyer, who had been sputtering incoherently, was instantly silenced. The color drained completely from Karen's face. She looked at the agents, then at the faces of her neighbors, her eyes wide with disbelief and panic. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was her world, her clubhouse. These were her rules. But the rules had changed. The game was over. "Arrest? For what?" she stammered, her voice a weak, reedy thing. "The warrant is for violations of 18 U.S. Code Section 641, theft of government property, Section 1505, obstruction of justice, and Section 1951, interference with commerce by threats or violence. Under the Hobbs Act relating to racketeering," Agent Chen recited, the legal terms landing like hammer blows. "Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Time seemed to slow down. The sight of a federal agent cuffing the overbearing HOA president in the middle of the annual meeting was so surreal, so cathartic, that nobody moved. They just watched, mesmerized. The clicking sound of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the room. It was the sound of justice, the sound of an era of petty tyranny coming to an abrupt and decisive end. As they led her away, Karen, in a final, desperate act of delusion, shouted, "You can't do this! I am the president of this association. I have rights." Agent Davies didn't even turn around. "You have the right to remain silent, Ms. Miller," he said over his shoulder. "I strongly suggest you start exercising it." They walked her out of the clubhouse and into the flashing blue and red lights of the waiting federal vehicles. The spell was broken. The room erupted, not in cheers, but in a wave of excited, relieved conversation. People were hugging Mrs. Gable. They were shaking Mr. Patel's hand. They were looking at me with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The remaining board members, looking shell-shocked, immediately tendered their resignations. The HOA, as it had existed under Karen's rule, was officially dissolved. The community had been liberated. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Kevin Miller's plea deal meant he avoided a long prison sentence, but he lost his business and was facing a mountain of civil liability. Karen, facing a formidable federal prosecution in our ironclad civil suit, had no choice but to capitulate. Her lawyer was replaced by a public defender. On the criminal side, she pleaded guilty to theft of government property and was sentenced to 18 months in a federal penitentiary. The judge made an example of her, citing her staggering abuse of a position of minor authority and her complete lack of remorse. On the civil side, it was a total victory. To avoid a drawn-out and public trial, the HOA's insurance carrier settled for the policy limit, which was just over $1 million. David Reed and I structured the settlement in a way that served the entire community. The first portion covered the full cost of the repairs and recertification of the van. my legal fees, and significant personal damages. The second larger portion was placed into a new Oak Haven Community Restoration Fund. This fund was used to reimburse every single resident for every fine Karen had ever levied against them. We went through years of records, and checks were cut for everything from unapproved welcome mats to improperly stored trash cans. Mrs. Gable received a check that she used to hire a professional landscaper to rebuild her husband's rose garden, bigger and more beautiful than before. The Patel family received enough to pay off the loan for their son's ramp. It was more than just financial restitution. It was a symbolic cleansing. The money she had extorted was being returned to the people she had harmed. The final act of the drama played out a few weeks later. A special election was held for a new HOA board. A slate of reasonable, community-minded residents were elected, including George, the retired accountant. Their first official act was to hold a public meeting where they went through the HOA covenants line by line, striking out the vague, subjective, and punitive clauses Karen had used as her weapons. The rule about commercial-looking vehicles was deleted entirely. The rules on garden aesthetics were simplified to basic safety and maintenance. The power of the HOA was returned to its proper function, to serve the community, not to police it. The war was over. Peace had been restored. But it was a peace that had been hard-won, a reminder that sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to meet their aggression with overwhelming, systematic, and legally unimpeachable force. Months later, life in Oak Haven Estates had settled into the quiet rhythm I had originally sought. The oppressive atmosphere of constant surveillance was gone, replaced by a palpable sense of relief and camaraderie. Neighbors were talking to each other again, not in hushed whispers about Karen, but in open, friendly conversation. Kids' brightly colored play sets were visible over fences, and no one cared. Mrs. Gable's rose garden was in full bloom, a riot of color and fragrance that filled her yard. The Patels had painted their son's ramp a cheerful, bright blue, his favorite color. It was no longer a violation, it was just a part of their home. The neighborhood felt like a community again, not a concentration camp of beige conformity. My van was back in the driveway. The FBI's tech teams had repaired the damage and completed a full systems diagnostic. It was fully operational once more, a quiet gray sentinel standing ready for its next assignment. But now, when I looked at it, I didn't just see a piece of equipment. I saw a symbol of a battle fought and won. It was a reminder that your property is your own and that your home should be your sanctuary. I was sitting on my front porch one early evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Sarah was beside me, and we were sharing a quiet, comfortable silence. My phone buzzed. It was a text from David. "It's done. The last of the settlement checks cleared. The restoration fund has been fully dispersed. We won, Jack, on every front." I texted back a simple, "Thank you, David, for everything." He replied almost instantly, "Don't thank me. Thank Karen. If she hadn't been so monumentally arrogant, none of this would have been possible. In a weird way, she's the best thing that ever happened to this neighborhood." I had to smile at the irony. He was right. Karen's obsessive need for control had been the catalyst for her own destruction and the community's liberation. By pushing so hard, she had forced a quiet man to fight back, and in doing so had awakened a dormant spirit of resistance in an entire neighborhood. Her tyranny had inadvertently forged a stronger, more united community in its wake. A few of the neighborhood kids rode by on their bikes, waving as they passed. "Hi, Mr. Caldwell," one of them shouted. I waved back. This was what I had wanted all along. Not the drama, not the fight, not the lawsuits, just this. The simple, profound peace of being home, of being a part of a place where people looked out for each other. I had learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes peace isn't something you find, it's something you have to make. Sometimes you have to be willing to go to war for it. And when a petty tyrant tries to take your peace away, you have to be prepared to dismantle their world, piece by documented piece, until all that's left is the quiet satisfaction of justice served. The legal battles were over, the fines were repaid, and the villain of the story was paying her debt to society. The neighborhood was healing, and so was I. The cold ball of anger that had sat in my gut for months was finally gone, replaced by a quiet warmth. It was the warmth of victory, the warmth of community, and the warmth of a peaceful evening at the end of a long, hard-fought campaign. The cicadas started their evening song, a soothing drone that filled the twilight air. It was the loudest sound on the street, and it was perfect. The new HOA board, led by George Oss, embraced a philosophy of live and let live. Their guiding principle was simple: unless a resident's actions were directly harming a neighbor's property or creating a genuine safety hazard, the HOA would stay out of it. The monthly newsletter, which under Karen had been a litany of threatening reminders and public shaming, was now filled with announcements for community potlucks, congratulations for graduating seniors, and helpful tips for lawn care instead of punitive demands. The transformation was remarkable. The fear of receiving a violation notice in the mail was gone, and with it, the resentment that had simmered just beneath the surface of Oak Haven Estates. People began to take pride in their homes again, not because they were afraid of being fined, but because they genuinely cared about their community. The aesthetic diversity that Karen had fought so hard to suppress began to blossom. Unique mailbox designs appeared. People planted vibrant flower gardens that ignored the old, restrictive color palette. The houses, once a monotonous sea of approved beiges and grays, began to reflect the personalities of the families who lived inside them. The neighborhood had found its soul. My own life returned to a comfortable routine. My consulting work continued, and the van was occasionally called into service, disappearing for a few days at a time before returning to its spot in the driveway. No one gave it a second glance. It was just Mr. Caldwell's van, and that was that. Its notorious past had become something of a local legend, a story told at neighborhood barbecues with a mixture of humor and disbelief. I found a certain dry amusement in the fact that the most controversial object in Oak Haven's history was now just part of the scenery. One Saturday, about a year after Karen's arrest, the new HOA board organized a Community Appreciation Day in the park. It was a simple affair with a bouncy castle for the kids, a barbecue grill manned by George, and tables set up for residents to share food and conversation. Sarah and I walked over, and we were greeted with warm smiles and handshakes. People I barely knew came up to thank me. They didn't talk about the lawsuit or the money. They talked about the change in the atmosphere, the feeling of freedom. Mrs. Gable brought me a small bouquet of roses from her garden. "From my husband," she said, her eyes shining. "He would have liked you." The Patel family was there, their son racing around on the grass in a new high-tech wheelchair, laughing with the other children. Mr. Patel clapped me on the shoulder. "You know," he said, "we were thinking of moving. We just didn't feel welcome here. You changed all that for us, Jack. You made this a real home." It was humbling. I hadn't set out to be a community hero. I had simply defended my property and my rights. But in doing so, I had inadvertently become a catalyst for a much larger change. I had shown people that you could fight back against a bully and win. I had shown them that the systems of power that seem so intimidating can be dismantled with persistence, documentation, and a refusal to be intimidated. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, I stood back and just watched. I saw neighbors who had been pitted against each other by Karen's rules now sharing a laugh. I saw children playing without a care in the world. I saw a community that had been broken and was now whole again. The legal victory was satisfying, and the financial settlement was just. But this was the true victory. It was the restoration of peace, the rebuilding of trust, and the return of a simple, decent way of life. My phone remained silent in my pocket. There were no urgent calls from my lawyer, no passive-aggressive emails from a power-crazed HOA president. There was only the sound of my community enjoying a beautiful evening together. I realized then that my war for peace and quiet had ended in the most definitive way possible. I had won not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of genuine harmony. And that was a victory far greater than I had ever imagined. The last I heard of Karen, she was released from prison early on probation and had moved several states away to live with a relative. Her name was now synonymous with the worst kind of HOA overreach, a cautionary tale whispered in neighborhoods across the country. She had sought total control and ended up with nothing. I, on the other hand, had sought only a small measure of peace, and in the end, I had found it in abundance.